Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Briji Jose. I am a faculty at the Department of English at Kristu Jayanti College, Autonomous, Bangalore. Today, what I will be discussing is this chapter titled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It is written by a neurologist called Oliver Sacks. It is part of the course called Fundamentals of English Written Communication, which is an additional English subject. And today we will be discussing this chapter. This particular chapter is actually taken from a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales, which was written in 1985. Now, this is a non-fictional text because it is a collection of certain case studies by this neurologist called Dr. Oliver Sacks, and it is a history of case histories of his patients, and it consists of primarily 24 essays. And what is intriguing about this particular book is that it gives you a very nice introduction into various neurological and psychological aspects of us human beings. And more than looking at it in a condescending way, it is a very unique and compassionate exploration of the human mind. So you don't have to be from the field of neurology or psychology to read this book. It is it's written in very simplistic language that any layman can sort of have access to the field of the human mind. And that is why this is a very interesting chapter to discuss. To quickly summarize the text, this is the first chapter in that particular book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Just like the title, the case study is also a very interesting study. It revolves around primarily this character called Dr. P, who is a brilliant musician, and he's also a music teacher. So he's somebody who functions normally. Like I mentioned, he can play music brilliantly, and he's somebody who's looked up to in society. But there are something off about it, in the sense that he will talk to water hydrants, or he will talk to knobs of doors and expect them to reply back to him, right? And it was considered as humorous. People would laugh about it. And he also just brushed it off. So for many years this happened until he's hit with diabetes, right? He gets diabetes, and he's sent to the ophthalmologist. And the ophthalmologist, on examining him, says there's nothing wrong with your eyes, but he recommends him to a neurologist because there are some problems with his visual parts of the brain. And this is where Oliver Sacks comes into the picture, because he becomes his neurologist who examines him. And on initial examination, he cannot really find anything problematic with this man, because he describes him as a very civilized man who knows a lot of things, right? He's a musician, so he's brilliant that way. He's talking normally, and he's also, the initial examination he passes off great, right? But there is something off in the way when he's talking, because he's not talking to Oliver Sacks. It's almost like he's observing features of his face. And the first sort of sign that happens during the examination is when Sacks asks him to put on his shoe. And Dr. P says, I have put on my shoe, but it was only his foot. So it's his inability to differentiate between what is a shoe, what is a foot, is the first sign where Sacks gets that hint that something is off, something is not wrong. And the main important thing what happens is the title of the essay. When they're leaving, Dr. P grabs his wife's head thinking that it's a hat, right? And what's more interesting is his wife considers this as complete normal behavior, right? She just laughs it off. They also just laugh it off. And that's where the title comes from, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. But that's when that's when Oliver Sacks sort of diagnoses this patient as, okay, he has a neurological disorder, and it sort of looks like visual agnosia, which is what the chapter deals with. And what visual agnosia is that patients are unable to recognize, draw, or recall objects or humans, even with a proper functioning eyesight, right? So that's why the ophthalmologist couldn't diagnose him, because the eyesight is completely normal. It is in the visual processing parts of your brain, right, where the image is not processed properly in your brain. And if you can see the image on the screen, right, it's an example of apperceptive agnosia, which is from the study done by Benson and Greenberg in 1969. So an A looks like that to them, or shapes look like this to them. So there is no clarity, or their brain is not processing how normally we see images around him, right? So that's the beginning of the diagnosis. And he puts it in a very interesting way. This is where the narrative style of Oliver Sacks becomes interesting, because he writes it this way, saying he saw nothing as familiar, right? Visually, he was lost in a world of lifeless abstractions. Indeed, he did not have a real visual world, as he did not have a real visual self, right? And how he comes to this diagnosis is because Sacks decides to go to Dr. P's house and observe him as he leads an everyday normal life, because this man's not been diagnosed. It's been years and nobody's found a problem with him. So he's kind of curious as to how he goes about everyday life and to have a proper diagnosis of what is happening exactly. And he goes and he gives him different objects. He tries to make him read music notes. He's unable to do that. He says he's not been able to do that for a very long time. He makes him feel objects and, gives him shapes to ask them what it is. So he feels the objects and he can perfectly guess what every shape is. What becomes interesting really is when he shows him pictures of his family members. And in ways this becomes sad as well, because he cannot really identify who the siblings are, right? Or what are the images being shown, his wife's image, his sibling's image. He cannot identify any of these pictures. What is most saddening is Sacks shows him a picture of himself, and he himself cannot identify who that person is, right? And that's the most interesting part, because you are so used to identifying yourself as a physical self because you see yourself in pictures or in the mirror, and this person cannot even identify themselves. So that becomes a clear turning point in the diagnosis, which also questions aspects of identities in terms of a neurological disorder. And he also talks about this idea of an internal agnosia, because one diagnosis aspect that he uses is he asks him about the novel Anna Karenina, which is a famous novel by Leo Tolstoy. And Dr. P is perfectly tracing out the plot of the story, saying this happens, that happens, but he's unable to describe the characters to him, right? Again, so there is no parts of how the characters look like. That's because he cannot visualize it internally as well, because outside itself, he cannot see anything. Internally as well, he's suffering a certain sense of agnosia, which Sacks sort of diagnoses, and he beautifully writes it down for the readers to understand. Another important aspect that the case study also talks about is how people with such neurological disorders adjust to an everyday life, right? Which is also seen in the story, in the case study, where as he goes and sits with him for breakfast, he also asks his wife, right, how does this man deal with it? He's had visual agnosia probably for a long time now. And she says he sings a song. He sings a song about everything, right? So when they're sitting down for breakfast, he's singing a song about eating breakfast. Or when he goes to take a bath, he will sing a song about it. So being a musician, that passion for music has sort of found ways in which he can adjust to everyday life, our ideas of normalcy that we have defined every day. He sort of sings songs to help with that. And an example is while they're eating breakfast, there's a loud knock, and this disturbs his rhythm or this song, and suddenly he's stuck, he cannot move, right? So that sort of breaks that rhythm, and you can see how he struggles with coming back to that. There's that shift when he starts singing the song again. So singing songs becomes central to the way he adjusts to everyday life. One important turning point where Oliver Sacks completely diagnoses visual agnosia for him is through these paintings. He's a painter, and his paintings are placed in a chronological order, which is from and in that order of sequence of changes in paintings, he clearly sees how visual agnosia has affected him as an individual. So initially the paintings are very naturalistic and realistic in nature, right? So a mountain or a river would be mountains or rivers. And from that, as you move on to the paintings, you can see how there is largely, the paintings move to a abstract geometrical or cubist paintings. I've given you an example in my PPT in terms of what a cubist painting looks like. So from real mountains and valleys and rivers, it moves into this art form. And his wife tells that's him as an artist moving, right? It's very conscious of him that his art form has changed over the years. But for Oliver Sacks, these are complete signs of advancing pathology. It's not his art form has changed. He cannot see things around him, hence his paintings has also changed. But in a positive sense, he also sees how this becomes a collusion between powers of pathology and creativity, right? Something which is seen as a deficit is something which blooms into beautiful art and creativity, right? Something which Picasso sort of worked with and tried hard to create cubist paintings. This man, because his visual agnosia that makes him unable to see things around him, it naturally comes for him to paint paintings like this. So in that way, it becomes this very interesting collision of a sickness and art which comes together, which is also discussed in the text, interestingly. And by the end of the case study, a neurologist usually prescribes medicines or anything of that sort. But what Oliver Sacks sort of says is his prescription for this man is a life entirely of music. He himself has understood, he's probably not understood what is going on or what is the deficit that he has, but in some ways he's naturally or automatically sort of adjusted to everyday life, and hence he prescribes his life entirely of music for him. Music takes the place of image, right? For us, we go about everyday life using images around us. That's how we understand the world. This man understands the world through music, and that's completely all right. And there's an instance where he teaches students, and he does not identify the students with their faces. He identifies them with the way they move, and that's what he calls as body music. Every day, everybody moves differently. Everybody has a different kind of body music within them, and his visual aspect is sort of identifying that. It's not in the focus of imagery. So as readers who's reading this book, you sort of see a very different way of how people with neurological disorders adapt to the everyday life, right? So coming back to a quick analysis of this particular text that we had chosen, one important thing about it is it gives you a fascinating insight into the human mind, right? The ways that the human mind is so fascinating, especially it's seen through a neurological disorder that way. And you can also see how Sacks sort of deviates away from how normally neurology treats patients, right? It's mostly CT scans, or it's completely restricted within a hospital space. But this man goes up and beyond, and he uses an external approach of interviewing patients and showing sort of empathy towards patients. There's a humanistic aspect to it as well. One another thing in the analysis is a celebration of human resilience, right? Like a neurological disorder in our society is usually seen as a deficit, like something is wrong with them. How will they adapt to everyday life? And you see throughout, not just this case study, but throughout the book, you experience a sense of human resilience that these humans portray, right? That despite having this sort of, there is no sense of a deficit that way, because they've completely adapted with the world despite having such things, because we have defined our ideas of normalcy, and despite them not fitting into normalcy, right? The wife becomes a very good example of it. She's completely adapted, though she understands, he doesn't understand the world the way she understands it. She's completely adapted to it and understood how he functions. So you just have to understand that and adapt to it as well, right? The complexity of identity is also talked about to a large extent, where identity, we largely talk about it being gender, class, and aspects like that. But it also is largely our brain which defines our identity, if we talk about it, right? So if you have a left brain or a right brain which is more active, it also largely determines who you are as an individual. And when there are parts of brain, when in terms of Dr. P, right, parts of his brain were heightened in terms of music, but visual aspects of it were lessened. So it also largely determines his identity as an individual, his inability to see himself as a person. The physical aspect of it also sort of influences the identity that he is. So the text sort of looks at that. Last aspect which we have talked about as well, the aspect of empathetic storytelling, right? Neurologists, from a scientific perspective, right, usually it's very rationally placed, or there is some sense of looking at it from, there's always a lack of empathy in that sense, right? But these texts are sort of very, there's no sense of sympathy where you're looking down on the person, oh, he has a deficit. It's Sacks completely trying to understand it from their perspective, trying to see how diagnosis is not easy. It's a more complex aspect, and hence that storytelling or the narrative style becomes very interesting from his perspective. So this is a text or a book that I completely prescribe for everybody to read. Like I said, from a layperson's perspective, especially if you're not from such disciplines, it becomes a very easy read for a lot of us and gives us access to these disciplines as well. So thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this discussion.